Iran is collecting $2 million per ship in cryptocurrency right now from the very governments whose tankers are supposedly blocked. That is the fact that the binary framing of open or closed misses entirely. And it is the fact that tells you more about the actual strategic situation in the Strait of Hormuz than any official briefing you will hear this week. I'm Stephanie Taylor. This is Strategic Review. The question I want to answer today is not whether Iran will reopen the strait. That question assumes the strait was closed in the first place, and that assumption is wrong in a way that is strategically important to understand. Iran doesn't need to keep the strait closed. It needs only the credible ability to close it within 15 minutes. That ability, that hovering threat, functions as an invisible tax on the entire global economy, a toll collected in currency that is not the dollar, through channels that bypass every sanction architecture the United States spent decades building. Before I walk you through the mechanics of the trap Washington is currently inside, I need to show you something about Hormuz that almost every mainstream analysis gets wrong. Because most people hear Hormuz and think expensive gasoline. And the obvious conclusion is almost always incomplete. Let me give you the geometry first. Pull up any satellite image of the Strait of Hormuz. It looks wide, comfortable, safe. Now zoom in. The actual navigable shipping channel is 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. Narrower than some American highways. Every supertanker heading into or out of the Persian Gulf must squeeze through this bottleneck, single file, twice a day. 21 million barrels every day, roughly 21% of the world's total liquid energy consumption, moving through a corridor you could cross in a speedboat in under 4 minutes. Iran controls the entire northern shoreline, over 100 miles of coast, with anti-ship cruise missiles positioned in hardened mountain bunkers overlooking the water. Hundreds of fast attack boats staged in dozens of ports, and something far more effective than either of those weapons: patience. Before the current escalation, war risk insurance for a vessel transiting the Persian Gulf ran around 0.1% of the ship's value, a manageable cost baked into the price of doing business. In 2026, that number has exploded. Western-flagged vessels are paying 1 to 3% per transit. At peak moments, quotes have hit 5%. Take an average supertanker worth $200 to $300 million. Insurance alone for a single pass through the strait now costs up to $7.5 million for one trip. 8 of the 12 largest protection and indemnity clubs, the backbone of global maritime insurance, issued cancellation notices for coverage in Gulf and Oman waters. Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, CMA-CGM, the 4 largest shipping companies on Earth, suspended bookings. Vessels are rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds 10 to 14 days and 25 to 40% to freight costs. But here is what most analysis misses, and I want you to stay with me here, because what moves through that 2-mile channel is not just oil. What moves through it is the physical infrastructure of the modern economy. And once you see the full list, the strategic leverage Iran holds looks completely different from the energy story you have been given. Helium. Qatar produces 30 to 33% of the world's helium supply as a byproduct of its liquefied natural gas operations at North Dome. Nearly all of it exits through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no pipeline alternative. There is no truck route. It goes by ship or it doesn't go. Helium is not a party balloon gas. Helium is the only element on Earth that can cool superconducting magnets to the temperatures required for two things: MRI machines and semiconductor fabrication. There is no substitute, no synthetic alternative, no workaround. When the helium stops flowing, MRI scanners go dark and chip foundries go idle. South Korea, home to Samsung and SK Hynix, two of the three largest memory chip manufacturers on the planet, imports the majority of its helium through routes that depend on the strait. A sustained blockade doesn't just raise prices, it physically stops production lines. The global semiconductor shortage of 2021 would look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. Fertilizers. The Persian Gulf accounts for up to 46% of the world's seaborne urea exports and roughly a third of global ammonia trade. Urea and ammonia are the building blocks of modern agriculture. Without them, crop yields collapse. Disruptions in early 2026 have already driven urea prices up 30 to 52% in key import markets like Brazil and India. Expensive fertilizer means expensive grain. Expensive grain means expensive animal feed. Every link in the food chain gets heavier, and the countries hit hardest are not wealthy Western nations with strategic reserves. They are nations in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Countries where food already consumes 60 to 70% of household income. Aviation fuel. The Gulf supplies roughly 20% of the world's seaborne jet fuel. European airlines have approximately 6 weeks of reserves. After that, flights get canceled, not rerouted. Naphtha, the petrochemical feedstock used to make plastics. Japan depends on Gulf naphtha for 70% of its supply. South Korea, around 50%. Petrochemical plants can't switch feedstocks overnight. They shut down. And when they shut down, the ripple hits everything from medical packaging to automotive parts. This is the true leverage, not oil. The entire physical supply chain of the modern economy runs through 2 miles of water that Iran controls. Now let me address the claim you will hear from every Western policymaker who wants to project confidence about alternatives: the pipelines. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline can move up to 7 million barrels per day at maximum capacity. After domestic consumption, roughly 5 million are available for export. The UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline adds another 1.5 to 1.8 million. Combined on their best day, these pipelines move 8.5 to 9 million barrels. The strait before disruption moved 20 million. That is a coverage gap of over 50%. And that gap applies only to crude oil. Pipelines cannot carry helium. They cannot carry urea. They cannot carry jet fuel, naphtha, or liquefied petroleum gas. Every single one of those commodities is 100% dependent on tankers transiting the strait. There is no workaround. The pipeline argument addresses half of one commodity category and ignores the rest of the problem entirely. So what are Washington's options? Option 1 is the one that sounds strongest and leads nowhere useful. compel Iran to reopen the strait through military force, and install a government that won't use Hormuz as leverage. The second half of that sentence is the problem. Installing a new government in Tehran requires a full-scale ground invasion, boots on the ground, occupation, state building. Everything the United States swore it would never do again after Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran is not Iraq. I need to say that precisely because every comparison between the two countries misleads. Iraq was a flat desert with a conscript army, a fractured population, and an isolated dictator who had alienated every neighbor. Iran is none of those things. Iran is a mountainous fortress, roughly the size of Western Europe. The Zagros mountain range, running over 1,500 kilometers along the country's western border, is a natural defensive wall that channels any invading force into predictable corridors. Corridors where defenders with dispersed missile systems, tunnel networks, and decades of guerrilla experience have every advantage. The population is over 80 million, urban, educated, and historically unified against foreign invasion. This is a civilization that fought an 8-year war with Iraq and absorbed 500,000 casualties without breaking. Any American president who orders a ground operation into Iran faces hundreds of thousands of troops committed, a supply chain stretching across hostile territory, casualty rates that would dwarf Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and a military budget already stretched across simultaneous global commitments. And it does not matter who sits in the Oval Office. A Democrat, a Republican, a populist, an establishment figure, the geography doesn't change. The mountains don't move. The population doesn't shrink. The asymmetric cost equation stays identical. The trap is not personal, it is structural, which is why the back-channel talks in Oman tell you everything about who actually holds the leverage. Washington pushed for a broad agenda: missiles, proxies, human rights. Tehran refused. Tehran is in no hurry. It can afford to wait. The United States, facing war fatigue, domestic political instability, and an election cycle that never truly ends, cannot. Washington is no longer demanding capitulation. It is negotiating for the preservation of the status quo. And the status quo is this: the United States maintains an extraordinarily expensive military presence in the Persian Gulf, spending billions of dollars to keep open a strait that Iran can close with a single drone or an unmanned fast boat in under 20 minutes. America is paying to guard a door that its adversary can slam shut at will. Now let me show you the final dimension, the one that makes this trap permanent rather than temporary, the one that no official Washington statement will acknowledge directly, because acknowledging it would require admitting that the foundational instrument of American economic statecraft, the sanctions regime, produced the exact opposite of its intended effect. The sanctions that were supposed to strangle Iran's economy have produced something no one in Washington predicted. In 2019, at the peak of maximum pressure, Iranian oil exports collapsed to 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day. By 2024, they had climbed back to 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels daily, generating roughly $35 billion in annual revenue. How? Through a shadow fleet of 600 to 800 tankers, nearly 10% of the world's tanker fleet, sailing with transponders off, insured outside Western jurisdiction, trading in currencies that are not the dollar. Iran, Russia, Venezuela. Sanctioned states did not simply absorb the pressure and endure. They built an alternative logistics network, an entire parallel economy priced increasingly in Chinese yuan, cleared through Chinese financial institutions, and designed specifically to be invisible to the enforcement mechanisms that American sanctions depend on. The engineering of this parallel system was patient, deliberate, and ultimately more sophisticated than the sanctions architecture it was designed to circumvent. Every new sanction measure produced an adaptive response that made the next measure less effective. The shadow fleet grew. The alternative payment infrastructure deepened. The yuan-denominated energy contracts expanded. America wanted to cut Iran off from global markets. Instead, Iran became a moderator of those markets in a currency that undermines the dollar hegemony Washington spent 70 years building. The sanctions did not strangle Iran. They were Iran's graduate school in alternative economic architecture. And the diploma Iran received was a functioning parallel economy that makes the next round of sanctions structurally less effective than the last. The shadow fleet that now services the toll road Iran is running through Hormuz was built with the blueprints that maximum pressure provided. Here is where the trap closes completely. The United States cannot remove the threat militarily. Without a ground operation, it cannot afford, financially, politically, or strategically. It cannot sanction Iran into submission because the sanctions created the very shadow infrastructure that now sustains Tehran. It cannot negotiate from strength because the geography, the asymmetry, and the ticking clock all favor the other side. Realist strategists, people who have spent decades analyzing great power competition rather than managing its domestic political consequences, have been saying this for years. The conflict with Iran is not driven by core American interests. It diverts resources from the competition with China that will define the balance of power for the next 50 years. It damages alliances in Europe and Asia, whose cooperation American strategy depends on. It signals poor strategic decision-making to every adversary watching and recalibrating their own risk assessments based on what they observe. And it represents what could become the third major American military failure in the Middle East, after Iraq and Afghanistan. Not because America lacks power, but because power has limits that geography and demography impose, regardless of budget. There is an additional complication that the official framing of this crisis consistently omits. Washington might be willing to reach a deal, an imperfect, face-saving arrangement that stabilizes the strait and freezes the status quo. The problem is that Washington does not negotiate alone. Regional allies have different calculations, different timelines, and different definitions of what constitutes an acceptable outcome. Every time diplomatic channels open, parallel actions elsewhere narrow the window. The space for compromise shrinks, not because of what happens in Tehran or Washington, but because of what happens between them. Diplomacy gets sabotaged not by the declared enemy, but by the geometry of alliances whose interests diverge at the critical moment. Every diplomatic exit from this trap leads into a corridor controlled by someone else's interests. The door is technically open, but every path through it requires navigating a set of competing veto players whose alignment on any specific agreement is not guaranteed and may be structurally impossible to achieve simultaneously. Can you permanently reopen a strait that can be closed by a $20,000 drone in 15 minutes? The honest answer is no, not permanently, not unilaterally. Only through an agreement with the person standing next to the handle. And that person is currently stronger than most analyses are willing to say out loud. Iran exports 1.7 million barrels per day, despite every sanction on the books. It collects $35 billion per year through channels that bypass the dollar entirely. It has turned the threat of closure into a permanent geopolitical toll, collected in yuan, not dollars, undermining the financial architecture the United States built across 7 decades. The question is not whether a deal is desirable. Everyone with a calculator knows it is. The question is whether the politics on every side, in Washington, in Tehran, in Jerusalem, in Beijing, will allow one to happen before the next operational escalation removes the option entirely. The door is technically open, but every exit leads to a corridor controlled by someone else's interests, and the person standing next to the handle is not in any hurry. This is Strategic Review. I'm Stephanie Taylor. If this framework changes how you see what is happening, share it with one person in your network who is still reading the managed headlines and missing the structure underneath. Subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in the next transmission.